Okay, in this particular video, we're going to talk about attributes, which you will find on pages 6 to 12. And attributes are just the qualities that describe a person or thing. You have a cell phone. It has a color. So the color would be the attribute, and the color might be white or red or blue, whatever you happen to have. So it's kind of like a property. Actually, it's exactly like a property, only we're going to refer to them as attributes in here. HTML elements can also be described in ways that web browsers can understand. And attributes are used to say something about the element that carries them. In other words, the tag that has that particular element. It says something about that. It could be what it looks like. It could be information that it needs, which you'll see in just a few minutes, but it's some type of property or attribute that we're going to use that helps say something more about the element than just the name of the element itself. They always appear within the opening tag. You will never in your closing tag have to put any attributes in there. So if we go back and look at sample from the last video, we have opening and closing tags here. We would put the attribute in the opening tag. For example, we might define a class. So we put that attribute in there, and we'll talk more about what I just did as we go on here. Here's the attribute class, and it has a value of summary, but I do not need to do anything else to the closing tag. They only appear in the opening tag. Most of them, as I just said, consist of both a name and a value. So you would have name-value pairs. The name is the property that you want to set with the value. What I just showed you was a class. That was the name of the attribute, and the value was summary. So the value then is what you want the property to be. Sometimes it can only be specific values. Other times it could be anything you want it to be. And we'll see those as we go through this. The values should always be in double quotes and separated from the name by an equal sign. So you can see in this sample here, the class, again, the name is class, the value is summary, and you should get in the habit also of not even having spaces in front of or after the equal sign. It's class equals, open your quote, put the value in, and close your quote. So the other thing I want to mention here too about quotes that sometimes some people have an issue with, some people copy and paste things from other documents, or they might have a PDF of the book, or they copy and paste something in there. Notice that these are straight quotes, not curly quotes. And they're straight in here because of the default value of the font that we're using in Notepad++. But if you get a curly quote, the HTML browser is not going to be able to recognize that. So you want to be careful about them. They need to be straight, like you would get with Helvetica or Arial or Verdana, and not curled like you would see with Times New Roman or something like that. HTML5 does have several attributes that do not have the name-value pairs that I just referenced. In that case, these are referred to as Boolean attributes. And we'll see those here in just a few seconds. Elements may have several attributes. They're not limited to just one. They could have several attributes. And an element should never have two attributes of the same name. Now, it won't throw an error, it won't cause your page not to work, but it'll only recognize the very first one. And this is probably a good time to talk about this too, as far as elements, the name of the elements, and the name of attributes. If the browser sees something that it doesn't understand, maybe because you misspelled it or mistyped it, it'll ignore it. It won't throw an error, it'll just ignore it. I've actually seen one browser that takes the last one and ignores the first one because it just replaces the value of the first one with the second one. So you can see the problem that's going to arise with multiple attributes of the same name. You're going to confuse the browser and you're going to confuse yourself on what it's supposed to look like. So let's take a look at example 2 from the books chapter. And in here we just added a new tag, and it's just a anchor tag. That's the A part here. It's an opening closing tag, and what is between it, in this case click here to visit Google's website, is what's going to display with a traditional, or the default I should say, blue with the underline. And we'll talk more about anchor tags next week, so don't be so worried about that. This example here is really for the attributes. In this case, the attribute that's being used here is href. What is the href? The href is that value, the URL of that page that you want to go to. In this case, the www.google.com. But that's one use of the attribute. If we actually look at this in our browser, we now have that link there. If we click on it, it takes us to where we want to go. Now, as I said lastly in the PowerPoint there, we could also have several different attributes for it. We could give it an ID, which we'll talk about here in just a second. Or I could give it one that's specific to the anchor tag, which is target. And that target would be underscore blank. Again, we'll talk about this next week. But now we have 3 attributes in here. We have the href, the ID, and the target. All the values have quotes around them, equal sign in between the name and the value with no spaces, and just a simple space in between each one. And even if you had more space, it wouldn't matter because the browsers ignore all white space anyway, with one exception, which we'll talk about later in the course. One of the things that you can do with browsers that will help you learn is you can always view the source of a page. Some of you may have already done this, but here's a page from a homework, just a sample that I had for students. And if you right mouse click on this, you will see a view page source. Well, if you click that, you actually see the HTML code that was used. Now, there's a lot of things in here we haven't talked about yet, such as the link and script tags. We'll talk about those as we go on here. We will get those. But you see the title tag in here, the head tag, the doc type, which we're going to talk about in the next video. You can see all the tags here, the divider, the a list item, which we'll be talking about in this week as well. But you can see the HTML. So if you're wondering how somebody did something, you can see. Now, it's not always going to look as nice as this. For example, in Blackboard, if we did a view source of this, and here you'll notice a lot of JavaScript code that it uses. It'll also, down at the bottom, instead of having content, there's a whole bunch of scripts there that are being imported. If we get down to the HTML, this is actually using frames instead of a regular document. Unfortunately, we're not going to talk about frames in this course, but frames are used by intranets like Blackboard is. It's not a public site, to be able to cut or turn that one document into multiple documents. So we'll leave that for a different discussion. But you can see the HTML. But here, as I said, it's going to be a lot more complicated than what you might expect. If we actually click in a frame, we'll just click over in here, we can look at that frame. For this frame only, we can view the source of it. And again, you're going to see a lot of JavaScript code. But when we get down to the bottom, the actual content, you can actually see here with dividers and anchor tags and links, or lists, unordered list, and list items. So you can actually see it, but you get all the other coding stuff as well. So keep that in mind, that that's one way that people learn is by looking at other people's code to discern exactly how they did it. Okay, as you already know from our discussion in the last video, an HTML page consists of elements that describe how it's structured. The element describes what you will find between its opening and closing tags, like a header or a paragraph. The opening tag can also carry the attributes that tell more about that particular element, which we just looked at. Much of HTML is actually a matter of learning what elements you can use, what each element actually does, and what attributes each can carry or implement. So that's the biggest part of what you're going to be learning here over the next 10 weeks in HTML is what the elements are, when you can use them, what it does, and how can you describe it with attributes. What attributes can you use? Now, as I briefly mentioned a little bit earlier, some attributes consist of only a name, such as required or checked. These are called Boolean attributes, and they're called Boolean because it can only be in one of two states. It's either true or it's false. In this case, required and checked are false by default, but then when you use them, as you see here, when you use them like this, then that changes them to true. This top line is exact same as the bottom line. One of the reasons why I have both of these on here is one, just so that you can see that this is false by default, and as soon as you use it, it's true by telling you that these are exactly the same. You just have less typing. However, if you were working in XHTML, this is the one that you would want to use, because XHTML is going to require all attributes to have a value. They can't just be single words. And I might also point out here, I was talking about the quotes before, so if you copied this and tried to use it in your code, this has those curly quotes. Many of the elements in HTML can actually carry all the elements that there are. That doesn't mean that they all do, but many of them can. There are actually three primary groups of attributes: core attributes, internationalization attributes, and accessibility attributes. And we'll talk about the accessibility attributes later in the term, but for right now we're going to look at the core attributes. The four core attributes that can be used on the majority of elements are ID, title, class, and style. An ID attribute is used to uniquely identify an element, such as your student ID or your social security number. Those are unique. Your driver's license number. Those should all be unique. There should not be someone else with the same student number or social security number or driver's license number. They are unique. So that means that there really should only be one per page. You don't want to have multiple IDs with the same value. You would actually use class for that, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit. So the ID, it's just ID equals string. What that string is whatever you want to name the ID. And the examples here, the ID equals accounts, ID equals sales. I can then specify styling to any paragraph or the paragraph with the ID accounts. I can do the same thing for sales. And it's now saying this is the paragraph that describes the accounts department. This is the paragraph that describes the sales department. There are a couple rules in naming convention, and actually this applies to the ID as well as many others like the class, but it must begin with a letter. It can contain alphanumeric, either uppercase, lowercase letters, all numbers, hyphens, colons, underscores, and periods. But it must begin with a letter. It doesn't matter whether it's uppercase or lowercase, but it must start with a letter. It must remain unique throughout the document, as I alluded to just a few minutes ago. And from the class's point of view, it should be meaningful. So accounts and sales are meaningful. If I did A or S, I would have no idea what that A and S stood for. So you want to make sure that they're meaningful. The class attribute is used to specify that an element belongs to a class of elements. The elements do not have to be all the same. So you may have several paragraphs on your page, and maybe 2 or 3 of them are dealing with new items, something that's new. So you might give them a class of, and give the class name, make the class name something like new items. And then apply that class to those multiple paragraph tags then that you want to apply styling that would come from that class name. We'll talk about that when we get into cascading style sheets. The elements that you apply this to do not have to be all the same either. You can apply this to a paragraph tag, to a header tag at the same time. The same class to those same tags. And there's no problem with that. So where the idea is for a unique element, the class can be applied to multiple elements. And then style sheets, which we're going to talk about later in the course, use that class name then to define how the element should look. The class attribute then can also have several class names. If you have several class names, you just list them all inside of the quotes with just a space between them. No comma, just a space. The styling of each of these will be applied in the order that they are listed. So all the styles for class name 1 would be applied, then the styles for class name 2 would be applied, then the style for class name 3 would be applied. The title attribute. This is just like a suggested title for the element. Behavior depends on the element itself, but most often it's used to display as like a tooltip on mouse over. And not every element that can carry the title attribute actually needs one. So when you meet an element that particularly benefits from the use of this attribute, you will see the behavior it has when used with that element as we go through the course. To give you an example of that within the page we were looking at, I could put a title in here and we'll just make it say click to go to Google. If I save this change and then view this in our browser, if I hover over this, then I get click to go to Google, which is what I typed as like a pop-up. Go back and take this out. Save it again. And as you see, it still says click to go to Google because I haven't refreshed it yet. So when you're actually writing code and you make changes, make sure that you refresh the page that you're looking at. As soon as I hit the refresh button, hover over this now, I don't get anything. So that tooltip, if you will, from the title is gone. The style attribute. This enables you to specify CSS rules within the document. In other words, do some formatting or styling within the tag itself. In this case, the style here is going to set the font property or font family to Arial and the color to red. We'll talk more about this when we get into styles of doing this. There's actually 3 ways of applying styles to a particular element. This just happens to be one of them. Again, in here we have name value pairs, font family and Arial, color, and a hexadecimal value. So we still have name value pairs. The style is the name of the actual attribute, and this entire thing in quotes is actually the value. And within that value there are name value pairs in there. We'll talk about the syntax when we look at styles. It's best to avoid the use of this attribute. You're better off placing it within the head of your sheet, your page, or an external style sheet. It's easy to access. It's right at the top of the page, or it's in a separate document that you can look at. And if you need to change it for whatever reason, you don't have to go sorting through all your code looking for where you styled something. You have that styling done in one central location. Again, we'll talk more about this when we get into styles. You will still see some of this done through JavaScript though, and we will talk about that after we're done with HTML when we look at JavaScript. I believe that's like chapter 11 or 12, something like that, but we'll look at using JavaScript to actually modify the HTML. Internationalization. This is the mechanism built into the tools that drive the web that allows authors like you to create documents in different languages. It's not all that well supported at this point. The two common international attributes that help write pages for different languages and character sets are the dir, which is direction, and lang, which is language. As I said, support of these attributes is somewhat patchy at this point, and you can get more information at the link that I have here on the page that is also mentioned in the book. But we'll take a look at these two attributes specifically. The dir attribute is used to indicate to the browser the direction of the text. Does it read left to right, or does it read right to left? When you want to apply this to an entire document, you should use it in the HTML tag instead of the body tag. And you should do that because the HTML tag has better support for the attribute. You can also then apply it to any header elements as well as those in the body. You can, however, use this within just one element within the body. So you want the whole page to read left to right, but one section you want to read right to left for whatever reason, then you can apply that direction attribute to that. It has two values. Remember I said sometimes you can put whatever you want, other times you have specific choices. The two choices you have are LTR, which is left to right, that's the default, or right to left, RTL, for languages such as Hebrew or Arabic that are read from right to left. And then we have the language attribute. This enables you to indicate the main language that's used in the document. It's designed to offer language-specific display to users. The benefits of using this attribute are actually, one, that the search engines use it to let you know the language of the document. Screen readers use it so that they know how to properly pronounce words. And applications use it to alert users if they do not support the language or it is not the default language. All languages values are of ISO 639-1 standard, which is a two-letter language code. And you can also specify a dialect within the language, as we quite often see in the US here, EN-US. English, US, as opposed to this English, which most other countries' English is just a slight bit different than US English. So that's it for the attributes, the core attributes and the internationalization attributes. In the next video, we'll look at the actual core elements that make up a web page.